the city of Lisbon, Portugal. And we're going to do this using the real estate market and some hedonic empirical estimation. So what's motivating our kind of research idea is that municipalities are increasingly becoming aware of the ecological and the social and citywide benefits that not only urban green spaces have, but specifically urban street trees. So when I talk about urban street trees, what I'm talking about is specific individual trees that are planted along urban thoroughfares and roads. However, it is difficult to obtain a non-market value of these trees. We know how much we can go out and buy a tree for, but we don't know really how much residents value these trees. So it's difficult to measure the trees, it's difficult to measure the different characteristics and the impacts on the local environment. So what we're going to do is to use a very rich GIS, a geographic information database, and we're going to look at what is the value of urban street trees in terms of a premium that comes through the residential real estate market. So how much more valuable are houses, conditional on having more trees around these houses in Lisbon. And then we're further going to look at some conditionalities. So do trees have additional benefits when they're located in other high amenity areas or low amenity areas, such as areas with high pollution, noise, heat, flooding risks, and neighborhood aesthetics. And so it's important in this whole analysis to kind of consider the relative spatial context. So we need to consider not only the location across the city, but also the relative context in terms of other amenities, as I said, pollution, noise, and other ecological amenities. So just to give you some examples, recently there's been a push for more greening strategies across the world, specifically related to urban street trees. So London, for example, has pledged around 20,000 new trees in 7 years. Toronto is looking for about 40,000 in the next 2 years, and they're actually earmarking about 3.8 million more trees over the next decade. So this is significant resources that are going to be dedicated towards these amenities. And additionally, with all this kind of new urban mapping and GIS mapping, a lot of new kind of software has been developed specifically related to urban trees. So there's just a couple of examples here of a few urban tree mapping softwares in New York. Atlanta has some. So across the US, there's quite a few of these maps of urban trees. And this does play pretty importantly into Lisbon's greening strategy. So within Lisbon, there's approximately around 600,000 trees, and there's a lot of discussion and policy debates ongoing about the location, where these trees should be located, planning of green corridors throughout the city, and the city is really pushing for more biodiversity and increased greening strategies. So just to give you a preview of our results, what we find is that approximately for every 10 additional trees within 100 meters of a house, there's going to be a premium of about 0.310% on the value of a house. So houses that have 10 additional trees more than average are going to sell at a premium of about 0.3%. And this decays over space as we consider larger and larger radii to about 0.06% within 500 meters. And then we do find that the value of trees is highly conditional on the location. So it depends very much on the types of trees that are planted, the density of the trees, the health of the trees, and whether these trees are located in high pollution areas of the city, noise areas, and other aspects as such. And we do find that there's actually a premium for special types of trees. And by special, I mean these more aesthetic types. So palm trees, the jacarandas, which are those nice purple trees that you see very commonly throughout Lisbon, they sell at a higher premium than average types of trees. And then we do find some variation whether we're considering deciduous trees, those are trees that are going to lose their leaves, or evergreens, which stay green the entire year. And then we do find that these trees actually have a positive influence on other amenities. So we're going to find that street trees are going to be able to mitigate negative disamenities. So having more trees around in an area that is more polluted is going to be more valuable to a resident, as we would expect. So I'll spend a bit of time going more over the data that we have, and then if you have questions about the actual estimation techniques we use, we can talk about that after. But the data is really what's kind of novel about this research. So we use a few different data sources. Câmara Municipal de Lisboa has a very, very good wealth of GIS databases, so all these spatial databases. So this is going to give us the location of all the green amenities, open spaces, parks, and other amenities throughout the city. The Lisbon City Service Development Kit also has the location of some amenities that we use. So this is going to provide us the location and the area of different types of aspects of the city. So we have housing prices that comes from Confidencial Imobiliaria. So it's housing list prices, structural characteristics, so we know around 32,000 observations, the value of the house, and structural characteristics associated to it. One important thing that we use in this data is we look at tree canopy. So we know the location of where every tree in the city is. So Lisbon has a database on the location of every tree. But using satellite images from Direcção Geral de Território, we're able to merge that with the actual size of the canopy. And I'll go more into that a bit later, but we're able to actually see how dense is the canopy of every tree. And then we complement this all with census data to control for other characteristics. So what we're interested in is kind of urban, ecological, and tree amenities. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at what is the impact of open spaces. So how are housing prices related to proximity to open spaces, which could be cemeteries, parks, gardens, urban forests, playgrounds, football fields, for example. Then we want to look at what is the concentration or the impact of having more concentration of urban street trees. So these are going to be classified according to types: palm trees, monumental, kind of historic trees, jacarandas, etc. And then we merge this with other ecological amenities to see what is the conditional value that these trees have relative to areas that have higher pollution, higher urban heat, higher urban noise, elevation, flooding risk, and these conservation or historic aesthetically pleasing zones of the city. So what I mean by urban street trees, so there's a few different types of trees that we're going to consider. We're going to look at evergreen trees. So these are trees that are going to remain green throughout the entire year. We have deciduous trees, which are going to lose their leaves in the wintertime. And then we also have bushes and shrubs, which are kind of low-lying trees. Monumental trees, what we mean by this, we know the location of all of these historic trees that have either a historic or a cultural significance to the city. There's about 100 or so monumental trees around the city. And then these are the jacarandas. These are these nice kind of floral purple trees that you see kind of planted along large avenues. And then we also consider palm trees. So just to give you an idea, so we have around 56,000 trees around the city, and we are able to locate all the trees in the city along different streets. So this is a map of Lisbon, and it shows you more or less the location of our evergreen trees, and these are our deciduous trees here. Mainly they are planted along streets. They are street trees, but you do see some trees planted throughout the parks and in other plazas, for example. Now what we're going to do is to merge this with other data. So we know the location of every tree in the city, and what we're going to merge this with is remotely sensed ecological variables. So what we do is to build a remote sensing algorithm, so kind of like taking Photoshop and looking at a satellite image, we decompose the satellite image into the spectral bands, and from that we're going to actually be able to locate the density of where we have canopy in the city. So we have a fairly high resolution of aerial photography, and it covers the entire city. So we're able to kind of look at the entire exposure of canopy around the entire city. So we're going to look at a house, we're going to look at how many trees are around that house, and we're going to look at what is the density of the canopy. And by canopy, for those that aren't familiar with this term, it just means the leaf part of the tree, so the upper green part of the trees. What we do find is that about 8% of the city is covered by urban tree canopy. So 8% of Lisbon is actually covered by greenery, specifically from urban street trees. So just to give you an idea, here is a bit better resolution there. So this is looking at the area of Marques de Pombal, for those of you that are familiar with Lisbon. And for example, what I would do is to look at a house, which is represented by that star there. And from that star, or from that housing location, we look at various buffer rings around the dwelling. Within each buffer ring, we're going to count the number of trees, and then we're going to look at the canopy. And the canopy comes from this remote sensing. So this is the satellite image that we have. And using an algorithm, we're actually able to classify to go from a satellite image into, so this is superimposing the location of the trees. And then eventually what we can do is to use an algorithm to come up with all the areas in the black that are representative of urban canopy. So we can look at the number of trees and then the percentage and the area size of canopy within different buffers around all the houses in our data set. So this is the example for one dwelling, and we do this for 32,000 dwellings in Lisbon. Now, for those of you that are interested in the empirical strategy, I'll go through this quickly. If you want to talk a bit more afterwards, we can. But we're very careful to control for all the unobservable influences, so this is a pretty heavy econometrics paper. We are decomposing our housing price into the value-bearing attributes. So we look at the price of a house, and then what we do with this empirical strategy here is to look at how much of the house is, or how much of the price of the house is going to be driven by the size, the location, the other local amenities, so the schools that may be nearby, and then what's of interest to us is the trees. So how much of the price of the house is going to be influenced by the tree. So this is our T variable here, so we look at the marginal impact that more trees have on the price of a house. And we are very robust in our estimation, so we do all the spatial tests, we control for spatial autocorrelation, and we are quite robust and confident in these results. So to go over the results, there's a few tables here, but generally what we find is, like I said, we control for a range of different characteristics. The ones that are of importance to us are going to be the greenery, the open spaces, and the tree-related characteristics. So what we do find in general is that the closer a house is to open spaces, the higher the price is going to be, as you would expect. So what we find is that not all the open spaces have the same type of effect, for example. So as you move further away from parks and gardens, our prices are going to decrease. So residents like to be closer to parks and gardens. But for example, cemeteries and sports fields, housing or residents like to be further away. So there is differences in how residents value different types of open space. So this tells us that we can't just consider a park or any open space to be the same. We need to consider the differences of these open spaces. Now, moving more importantly onto our tree variables, what we find is that if you have more monumental trees around, on their own, one monumental tree has a fairly significant impact on price. So in our models here, it comes out to be about 0.075 per every monumental tree. So the average price of a dwelling is going to be 0.075 higher if you have a monumental tree nearby. In terms of just looking at street trees, we do see a very significant positive impact. So in the first row there, we see that every additional street tree in 100 meters, so 100 meters our first column, 300 meters and 500 meters, we look at various specifications. So within 100 meters, every 10 additional tree is going to increase housing prices about 0.3% of the price of the house. What's interesting, however, is that if you increase the number of street trees and increase the size of the canopy, this is actually going to have a negative effect. So what we find here is that although residents like to have more trees around, the denser the trees are, the worse they are going to be. So the worse in terms of lower housing prices. So this has to say that although a resident may enjoy having trees around their house, if the trees are too dark and too dense and there's too much canopy, this could be inhibiting, for example, light or pollution, or it could be kind of exacerbating negative effects from trees. What we do find, however, which is actually a positive benefit, is that if you have more trees around that are healthier, and that NDVI measure there, that's just a measure of how healthy the trees are, so we can get that from our data as well. If you have more trees that are healthier, then you actually want more trees around. So you want trees around in general, you want less trees that have more canopy, and you want more trees that are healthier. So it's important to consider how we classify or how we consider these types of trees. And when we consider the types of trees, now not only distinguishing by the canopy and the health of the trees, but by the actual species of trees, we see there's a wide range. So palm trees, for example, are going to have a very high positive effect. Shrubs are going to have a negative effect. So shrubs are kind of ugly, low-lying trees. And then deciduous trees are going to kind of be the baseline value. So what we see is that the more aesthetic that the trees are, so if you have a palm tree or a jacaranda, which is these nice purple trees, the better off you're going to be. Residents value these trees more, and they're going to want to sell their house at a higher price because of this local amenities. So this is just previewing some results. So healthier trees are good, darker, denser trees are worse, and it may be just because of shading and darkening of the neighborhood. Now, in terms of the interaction effect, so without going too much into detail on the kind of empirical aspect of this, what we do is to look at how is the value of these trees conditional on other aspects of the neighborhood. So do you want to have more trees around if you live in a neighborhood that is more polluted, for example? And what we find consistently is that the more, although we see canopy tends to have a negative effect on its own, there is still an ecological benefit to having more canopy around. So just on its own, residents tend not to like just having more denser, darker trees. But if you live in an area where, for example, in the first column you have flood risk, so if you live in a flood risk area, having more trees with higher canopy is going to be a benefit. So these trees obviously have a range of ecological values. Reducing the stormwater runoff is just one of them. So we see here that the price, this is going to be captured in the price of a dwelling. And this is the same when we consider urban noise. So we know trees are going to be a good boundary for urban noise, pollution as well, urban heat, and elevation and conservation areas. So the more trees that you have around in these worse off neighborhoods, the better is, or the higher is, your housing price is going to be. And just summarizing these results, we do see that these interaction effects are positive. So more canopy does have above and beyond additional ecological benefits in terms of pollution, noise, and flood risk. Those are kind of the most important ones. Now, what this means is that when we consider where we should be planting trees around the city, we should be considering the relative location of where we're planting them. So if we know that an area of the city is very prone to high flooding risk or has a high pollution level, for example, then it's going to be, or have the highest spillover effects if we plant more trees and a higher canopy in these areas. So this is what we want to kind of look at and discuss with this paper. So not only do trees have the potential to influence housing prices, but it has kind of spillover benefits through other neighborhood amenities. So what's more difficult is to measure these, and what we're showing in this is that we can actually measure these values of the trees using very specific and very detailed GIS databases. And so this opens up a range of additional research that we can focus on. And we should be considering the location, the relative location. So we shouldn't just be planting trees anywhere, but we should be considering where we're planting them. One other thing that's interesting is that these trees may be used as an alternative to open spaces. So for example, if we are in a congested downtown like Baixa in Lisbon, maybe we don't need to plant or to build a park. Maybe we can just plant a couple of trees, and that's going to have the same benefit as a park would have in, for a resident. So just to conclude, these are the results that we find. We do find that there's a big difference across the types of trees, and using these very detailed databases, we are able to capture and very detailed measure the types of trees and the heterogeneity of these trees across the city. So it's important to consider how these trees are going to interact with the local environment, and this is going to be important for municipal planners and developers of residents and for the residents themselves. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. The next presentation from SINEAD, I think it has, it's a little bit different from this one, and I think it's better to open the discussion now about this very good presentation, very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask if everyone has questions about this presentation. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Some questions. Did you separate the dense trees that are on street and in parks? Because I think might have...
So the way that the data is, we only have the street trees, the locations that are planted along the trees, the public trees. The ones in the parks are not a member of that database, but that would be captured in the canopy.
Okay.
So it's not captured in the location, the number of trees, but it's captured in the canopy density.
Yeah. And how much do you think these results are specific to Lisbon, and how much you can use it, or
So in
at least
general,
the
our
methodology?
results, so there hasn't been a lot of research in this area because the data is so difficult to get, but in general our results are in line with other American cities. In terms of the actual canopy density, we do find that Lisbon has a lot less canopy than other big cities. So, for example, some of the American cities, for example, have about 25% canopy coverage, and Lisbon has 8%. But the actual value that they actually kind of add to the residential real estate market seems to be in line. So I think it's pretty much kind of consistent.
I understood you used structural equation modeling?
Sorry?
Did you use structural equation modeling in your
No,
methodology?
it's not a structural equation.
Okay.
It's just kind of a spatial econometric
Okay,
model.
thank you.
More questions? I just have one very, very contextual one. I saw that you looked at on the methodology on the magazine of Confidencial Imobiliário, and it's a very useful tool to understand and to study real estate in Lisbon. When I was listening to your question, I looked at the map. And there's a territory, Monsanto, here in Lisbon that has, well, it's the biggest park, but it's surrounded by social housing and some kind of public housing process, but it has a lot of voids. Do you believe that it's possible to put this kind of real estate, new houses in that area? What do you think about it?
So the data that we have is kind of separate from social housing. We're using kind of free market rental price, like actual price of dwellings. But I would imagine that the value of the results would be very similar. So the results should still see that we have positive effects because this is an average result across the house. So we don't include kind of any rent-controlled houses, social housing, because that kind of deviates from the average. Mm-hmm. But we do get an average effect. So the average effect should still be valid. Across, the value may be a little different than the actual 0.3 that we estimate, but in general we should see that the magnitudes wouldn't deviate too much from other sub-markets of the real estate market.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was just wondering, you're kind of using real estate prices as like the value of the trees. Did you consider looking more subjective valuations of like how much do you appreciate greenery in your neighborhood? Because it's an economic measure, and there can be like various reasons for people like agreeing that it's like making the neighborhood more attractive, but it might not reflect like actual how much you appreciate it.
No, exactly. So what we do, and I didn't mention too much, but the actual strategy that we're estimating only gives us the lower bound. So this is the absolute lowest that it could be, conditional that we're measuring it from real estate prices. It's not taking into account the use values of the trees or the personal subjective values of the trees. So this would be the lower bound. And of course, I would imagine that that's also going to depend on regions. People are going to value trees differently in different areas. So you would imagine that maybe the patterns are going to be similar, that you value trees in more polluted areas, for example. But it would be nice to kind of complement this with other kind of more subjective measures, more kind of qualitative measures that asking people. But we haven't done that in this study. So we're just looking at kind of the lower bound, conditional on using housing prices. But there have been some studies that have kind of merged the two.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Let's have the presentation for SINEAD.
I might knock that down. Just so I don't hit it. Yeah, so my project is definitely different. And it's my PhD research. It does not necessarily relate to geography from the outset. It relates more to the employability agenda in higher education in the UK. in general, this agenda tends to be very much focused on metrics, on numbers, on how you can prove that certain people going to university will get certain types of jobs. But what I suggest, and because the data and the literature shows that there is still a skills gap between the supply and demand of labor for science education, for example. And through this project, what I've found is that, as I suppose many of us would expect, geography does play a role in how people make decisions about how they transition from higher education to work. Hopefully, by the end of the presentation, it will make sense why I'm presenting something on geography when it doesn't seem to sound relevant at all. If not, we're probably in the same boat. I'll just go very quickly with these. Oh, it's not updated my... Okay, this is not my updated presentation. I've saved the wrong one. But anyway, so I'll just talk through it quickly. So I'm not sure if anyone knows, but within Europe you have a large push for the massification of higher education. In the UK in particular, it was because of a change in the economy, the change in political system that resulted in more people wanting to, or countries wanting to develop a knowledge society. Eventually the higher education system was overloaded, more people were getting into higher education, so universities started charging fees. In the UK, the fees at the moment are £9,000 a year, which is ridiculous. But still people are being forced through the system because that's how you access jobs. And so the universities have this sort of pressure on them to develop strategies to get people into work. And the strategies don't always work. And the reason why they do not always work is somehow not known to people. And I want to suggest that rather than going through metrics, we can understand how and why people make decisions about where they go next based on their individual circumstances and the processes of making decisions. Ideally, there should have been... Right, sorry. I'm just trying to figure out what's saved in this version. So there are 3 stages in which I can say that the process of decision-making takes place. Firstly, it's how you transition into higher education from school, and that usually is a process that relates to geography, because unlike school, you go to your local school, and that's how schools are allocated. Whereas with universities, you can apply and go elsewhere. I'm not going to go into details about this, but there are various aspects which result in movement of large student populations, and it creates what people have called the studentified cities, or the studentification of cities. And earlier in the day we were talking about touristification, and this is a sort of similar concept where you have these temporary populations moving to a place, influencing it, having an impact on how the region is planned. And there are various factors that contribute to decision-making when you get into university. In general, the idea of university is understood in terms of, it's training, it's meeting the needs of the market, but actually when it comes to understanding what people want and how students make decisions, aspects of mobility, freedom, and independence become more important. And it results in the creation of university as a different other space, and a space that Holdsworth calls, suggests as being more than just going to access education, but as a space of becoming and belonging and transitioning into adult life. And that's sort of the aspect of space that I'm finding, which is about emotional geographies. That's gone off. The image over here was supposed to show you how people move from one location to another location for higher education and then into work. But what I'm going to do is just present you with two cases really quickly. And it sort of shows how geography does actually play more of a role than is expected or as is accepted within the sort of discourse around higher education and understanding trajectories and access to education as well. So first, I have two participants. You have Ash and Tony. So Ash comes from the, oh, I had a map here as well, but it's not here. Anyway, Ash comes from the northeast of England, and Tony comes from the southeast of England. There is a regional divide in the UK because the north tends to be very industrial or has an industrial history, and therefore the type of society in there is very much working class. Whereas as you go to the south, because you have London as a hub, you have the finances flowing into some of these lower southern spaces, which are not necessarily reflected in the sort of northern parts of England, and it's commonly referred to as the north and south divide. And then you sort of have these ideas of the northern powerhouse after that. But the way in which both of the participants narrate their experience and their rationale for moving to their current location. So Ash did not return home, he went to London instead to find a job. Whereas Tony returned back home and he's living with his parents, like many of my other participants who are originally from the south and then moved to the north, which their current university is. And whereas people from the north all moved away from home. Nobody wanted to return home. And that sort of gives you some idea about how, even when we understand the rural and urban dynamics, there are still aspects of understanding further what the financial aspects or the financial motivations and differences and divisions in society, how they play out for each of these individuals. The second case I want to tell you about is Jane. Previously I'd spoken about this idea of the university as a space of becoming, and that space is very important in understanding that aspect of it being a space of transition of people becoming adults. Many of the students come in at around 17 and a half years old and 18, and then they transition. These are the formative adult years. And for Jane, for example, she felt that she couldn't get into, I had trouble getting into university life, if you know, if you like, into student life, because I've not been very good at drinking. And in England, there's a very strong drinking, alcohol consumption culture, which some people just don't fit into. But that is like an initiation process, and that's what strengthens this idea of the heterotopia. You go somewhere else to become, but for some people, you cannot become, and you do not fulfill these sort of criteria. So for Jane, who entered as a first-ranking student, she got really high grades, she left with the lowest grade on the grading structure possible. And that happened because her understanding of space and her association with space was that of disbelonging and not fitting in, of isolation, rather than the dominant idea of everyone goes into this university space to become and develop as a person. Therefore, her transitioning process and her trajectory of change and transitioning from higher education into work related more as a desire to just return home because she couldn't deal with the environment of the university. That was supposed to be a conclusion slide, but that's not there. So in conclusion, what I do want to say is that some of these aspects, when we talk about suggestions of what people must do and how they transition, do not necessarily relate to the lived realities of individuals. And what I have done to analyze the data is I've used a very actor-based approach. I've used critical realism, developed by the sociologist Margaret Archer, and it looks at how decisions are made through various ideas of how people identify concerns, and then they develop projects, personal projects, and then they go on to this becomes practice, rather than understanding it as a process of external factors influencing all of the decisions made. And for that reason, I did not accept things like conditioning approaches, such as the dominant Pierre Bourdieu understanding of social class and class analysis, capital analysis. But instead I took something that was more relating to how people do transition. And I think I'm done.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay. Some more shine. Okay. I have exactly a question about what you were saying in last, about the your choice about the transitions of life against the traditional sociological approach of social and capital approach. Can you please demonstrate why the traditional categories of change does not make sense on your object?
So in previous studies, the way in which they determine choice, or they can understand the decision-making process, it is defined primarily, so you have the deterministic approaches, which suggest that you obviously follow into these paths because you are capable of doing these things. So it's a very sociobiology perspective of how you can do something because you have that innate capacity. Whereas you have the conditioning approach, which tends to use things like gender, class, and those sort of aspects to understand how people move and transition. Both of these two participants of mine in the first case study are both from working class backgrounds, and they both have graduate jobs. The next person is from a middle class background, and she does not have a graduate job just because she's returned home, then she couldn't get a job just because she wasn't in the mental state of mind to be able to get a graduate job. So I think that the current approaches are very limiting because it's both very damning, whereas I think in late modernity and our current society, it's more the case that every individual requires to use critical reflexivity or a form of reflexivity to negotiate everyday life and make sense of the various changes. And for some people, that process is a lot slower than others. And it's not always the case that the toolkit that class, for example, allows you is going to always push you forward, if that makes sense.
Of course, of course. Any other questions? Okay, thank you a lot.